I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on human subjects research and how it came to be such a heavily regulated industry. There is a set of federal regulations, 45 C.F.R. 46, HHS regulations that govern research with human subjects. They were promulgated back in the 1970s, the first set 1974, in response to abuses of participants in research, and in particular in response to what is commonly referred to as the Tuskegee syphilis study, also called the United States Public Health Service study of syphilis in Tuskegee. 400 African American men were deprived of treatment for syphilis because investigators with the US government decided that they wanted to follow the natural course of the disease and see what sorts of differences there might be in the course of the disease between Caucasians and African Americans. There was no informed consent. The men were deprived of treatment, and in fact, they were told that they were getting some treatment when they were getting things like aspirin and they were having spinal taps done. This went on between the 1930s until the early 1970s. So this is one of the longest running, as the New York Times called it, the longest running non-therapeutic biomedical studies in the history of this country. And it was really, really terrible. And the story broke in 1972. In the New York Times, the Washington Star actually, article came first in the summer of 1972, and then followed by an article the next day in the New York Times. And the government took a step back and said, okay, we can't allow this to happen again. So regulations were put in place. They were initially intended to protect against abuses in biomedical research. So in the early 1970s, that was the intent of the federal government. But they evolved to, in theory anyway, protect individuals participating in biomedical research and behavioral research, social, behavioral educational research. And one of the interesting things to note, and what I find particularly interesting, is the way that the internet has changed the way that human subjects research is being conducted. Clearly, the internet was not an issue when these regulations were first put in place back in the 1970s. But in order to understand kind of this whole regulatory scheme and the way that the internet is used in research, I think it's important to understand what a human subject actually is, because it is a defined term in 45 CFR 46. So a human subject actually is a living individual, so no cadaver research, about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction. Okay, so those are the key terms there, with the individual, or identifiable private information. So the regulations go on to explain what an intervention is, and it's probably what you might typically think of: a blood draw, an investigational drug to cure any number of diseases, manipulations of the subject or the subject's environment. It's any kind of, for example, a study that is looking at the relationship between obesity and diabetes. It's putting research participants on a diet and exercise regimen and changing the way they eat and the way that they exercise to see if that has any impact on their health. An interaction is a communication or interpersonal contact between the investigator and subject. All right, so interviews between the investigator and a research participant. Anytime that an investigator obtains information by talking to somebody, whether it's actually in person, over the phone, over the internet, an active communication, so keep that in mind. And private information is really what I am most interested in, because there are implications in the definition of private information related to reasonable expectations of privacy. Information about behavior that occurs in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place. Information shared for specific purposes that the individual can reasonably expect won't be made public. And just a point of note that information actually has to be individually identifiable for the research to be human subjects research. So what I was really interested in was what uses of the internet, because the internet has changed the way, and I'm talking about academic research. Okay? The internet has changed the way that academic researchers are conducting their research. So what uses are human subjects research? And are there uses of the internet that are not human subjects research because they don't involve the collection of identifiable private, emphasis on private, information? And data mining on social networking sites is one of those areas where it's not entirely clear just from looking at the definition of a human subject what the answer is. And most importantly, how do we clarify these issues for researchers and for institutional review boards, or IRBs, which are the committees that are charged under 45 CFR 46 to review any research that involves human subjects? Just a little bit of history of privacy in 45 CFR 46. When 45 CFR 46 was first promulgated back in the 1970s, human subjects was not a defined term, and private information was also not a defined term as they are today. Human subjects was actually a term that was used throughout the regulations, but what was actually the defined term in the definition section of 45 CFR 46 was a subject at risk. And you'll notice from this very, very lengthy definition that nowhere in there is mention of privacy or private information. That didn't happen. The government didn't really consider privacy or private information specifically until the National Commission, which is the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, came along and published a report about IRBs. And the National Commission did this because they were actually charged under the 1974 National Research Act to evaluate human subjects research in this country, particularly because of the Tuskegee study. This was not actually their most well-known or famous report where they first talk about human subjects and private information. They're most well-known for writing, and people may or may not have heard of this, the Belmont Report, where they came up with the 3 basic ethical principles that govern research with human subjects. But in 1978, they published this other report on IRBs. And at that point, human subjects were actually defined. And at that point, they considered defining private information. And when, in 1981, the Department of Health and Human Services revised Health, Education, and Welfare's original set of regulations under 45 CFR 46, they adopted the National Commission's language and actually considered privacy to be an important issue in human subjects protection specifically. And of note, the definition has since remained the same. There are a number of uses that researchers are making of the internet to conduct research. And of note is that there are no specific regulations that actually tell researchers or IRBs how to handle internet research. There's no guidance that's been published. The best that researchers and IRBs can do is kind of make their best interpretation of the regulations and go from there. As far as the uses of the internet to conduct research, there are a couple of key ones. There's the distribution of surveys through sites like SurveyMonkey. REDCap is actually a system that has 2 functions. It's a data management system. It's kind of like a very fancy Excel spreadsheet, but it also has a survey distribution function. And it allows researchers to distribute anonymous surveys, to receive the surveys back, and then they can control who on their study team actually has access to the responses, to any potentially identifying information that may be transmitted. It's a great system. There's also a fair amount of recruitment for human subjects research that's done on the internet. There are sites like Craigslist where if you look up any city in the country, you will inevitably see postings on there for any number of clinical research studies or behavioral research studies. Pharmaceutical company websites, Pfizer, Novartis, are putting up ads on their own websites, advertising for research participants, even giving research participants the opportunity to look to see if they may qualify for participation in a particular study. There are Facebook pages devoted to specifically looking to recruit people for research. In my estimation, these are more clearly human subjects research because there's interaction involved. There is the active act of obtaining information from individuals that's going to the researchers. There's also potentially private information that's being conveyed in these surveys or even as part of the recruitment process. But there are other other uses, like data mining on social networking sites, which I don't think are as obviously human subjects research, which leaves the question of what to do with it. When I say data mining on social networking sites for academic research purposes, what I'm talking about is researchers who log on to sites like Facebook or MySpace or Twitter, and they look at the information that they can see, and they can see it for any number of reasons. They can see it because it's publicly available. They can see it because they're part of a network at the university where they are doing their research. And they are looking at it and they're recording it for any number of research purposes to see how people form friendships, how people keep friendships, what the relationships between people's political persuasions may be and their religious views. You name it, and they're looking at it. It's done in biomedical and social and behavioral research. And important to note that it's often done without the actual knowledge or permission of the people whose pages are being screened. Now, despite this, there's typically no intervention involved, and if there is an intervention, then it's usually more clear, and that's clearly human subjects research. I've looked in the past at whether the definition of an interaction really fits this type of work, and because there's no active communication between the two parties, between the researchers and the individuals in these circumstances, it's likely not an interaction either. It's more of a one-sided, the researcher logs on, looks at the information, writes it down, and that's the end of it, as opposed to an active communication between the two. And I also have thought long and hard about whether this involves the collection of private information. And for my purposes, I'm assuming identifiability, which is a whole other issue as far as whether information is or is not identifiable. But for these purposes, I am presuming identifiability, so I will say that. Some examples of studies that are being done like this, there was one in particular done out of the University of Florida where researchers from the medical school looked at Facebook pages of medical students and residents to figure out if there were any narratives or photos that were being posted about patients that could possibly represent a violation of patients' privacy, to see, are people behaving appropriately online? Are these students doing what is necessary to protect the privacy of their patients? Are the residents doing this? So that's just one example. There was another study that was done out of Harvard a couple of years ago where the researchers mined data from a class at Harvard. They took a whole bunch of data from almost all of the students in one particular class, and they created a data set that they were going to make available to other researchers to do any sort of research with, but they would have to get permission to access the data set from the researchers who collected this information. And it turned out that the data set was actually removed, and the researchers who collected it decided not to make it available to other researchers because there was an issue with identifiability in the way that the data set was being presented to other researchers. But it was, this was a whole just plethora of data about people in one particular class at a college. It was a huge data set. So lots of research in this area. But back to the issue of privacy specifically, and what is the reasonable expectation of privacy that people might have, and is there even a reasonable expectation of privacy? Courts are saying no, and they are saying no consistently. They are saying that there is no social networking site privilege. This is coming up a lot in personal injury cases, but it also comes up in family law cases. It's come up in other sorts of cases, but it's usually personal injury in the context of discovery. And so courts are declining to recognize this privilege, and they are saying that the information is subject to discovery because there is no reasonable expectation of privacy.